Welcome, everyone. Today I'm interviewing Maia Poet. Maia is a detransitioner, writer, public speaker, and cat lover. Her detransition story is very unique as she lived in Israel on October 7th, and surviving the Hamas attack transformed her perspective on gender identity and transitioning. So we'll be talking about Maia's story, her views on gender identity ideology and gender medicine, and her advice to parents of trans identifying youth. Maia, welcome to the podcast, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Kat, for having me on. It's a real pleasure, and I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I'm really happy that we've finally got a chance to connect. So, I guess my first question is just tell us a little bit about your story. Did you start to feel uncomfortable as a girl early on in your life, or is this kind of something that developed later?
Well, I've got to say, I was an extremely non-conforming child. I think even calling it gender non-conforming doesn't really do the level of non-conformity that I embodied and experienced as a child any justice. I was born pretty early, and I had a lot of developmental delays, and also a lot of gifts at the same time. So I was a really kind of atypical child. As a youngster, elementary aged kid, I was just fascinated by like this rare pituitary tumor called acromegaly that makes people grow super tall. Other people might know it as gigantism. I was obsessed with, learning everything I possibly could about this brain tumor. And once I'd exhausted everything on YouTube I could find, I would try to read medical journals. And of course, I was an 8-year old, so I couldn't really understand the language, but I really kind of challenged myself to learn everything about this pituitary tumor. But at the same time, I didn't learn how to tie my shoes until I was 14, right? I didn't learn how to swallow liquids properly without suckling on them like an infant would, also until I was 14. But I was out here just trying to like research niche pituitary tumors as an 8-year old. So my development has always been all over the place. And, as a kid, I very much existed in my mind. I was very cerebral. I had very little understanding of how kids my age operated. And so I then developed an obsession with like parenting books when I was about 9 or 10, just to try to understand how it is that kids operate. Like I've always taken this really cerebral approach. At the same time, I was not particularly great at identifying my own emotions. I always existed in a state of kind of sensory chaos. I'm very sensitive to all kinds of different, textures, different types of sensory input, not great at reading social cues, just generally confused. I very much existed in my head as a kid. I had this, imaginary universe. So I never really, had this mechanism of going to kids my own age and kind of discussing things with them to figure out what's normal and what's abnormal, which would kind of later sort of be a one of those more profound deficits that kind of entrenched my journey as a little kid because I existed so much in my imagination and I really didn't understand the difference between imagination and reality. I started to understand that difference probably around the time I hit puberty, which was around maybe 9 or 9.5.
Mm.
Before then I thought, it's possible that I'll grow up to be a boy. I also thought it would be possible, maybe less possible than being a boy would be the possibility of turning into something akin to like a bird or an airplane. So I had a very tenuous grasp on reality at best until a far later age than most kids my age had. So I had like a lot of just general confusion, before I started encountering these ideas online. But I wouldn't say that it was like particularly strong gender dysphoria. It was mostly just like confusion about the boundaries of reality itself, just trying to understand the world in a cerebral way as opposed to in an embodied way. And that's allowed when you're a little kid. Everybody expects you to kind of be, maybe more in your head, maybe more imaginative, really quirky. Like those things are acceptable when you're a kid, and even being a tomboy is accepted when you're a kid. But then, like when you hit puberty, especially like for girls, a lot of parents and a lot of sections of the society will really expect you to like, fem it up, to start dating boys, being interested in boys, and then femming it up, and to become more socially aware. And so I think that this is sort of what my parents expected to happen. But for me, it just didn't happen. I didn't become less quirky. I just kind of became it's just that, my quirks kind of became more obvious because they weren't going away. Later, a couple of years later, I would be diagnosed with ADHD and medicated for it, and the meds totally changed my life in a lot of ways, kind of made me realize that for the last 14 years of my life, I'd been living on a totally different planet from everyone else. But, before I was medicated, I was trying to find all these ways of getting my brain to just work. I had this like kind of discomfort in my body, and part of it was related to puberty. I mean, a lot of it because I hit puberty much younger than the girls in my class did. And at the same time, like there was this visceral embodied discomfort of struggling to process sensory input. When I was 12, there was really this turning point where like I got an iPad for my 12th birthday. I was excited because I could explore whatever topic of interest and have all this information at my fingertips. Before I had my own iPad, I would have to ask my parents to buy books, and I'd have to wait on the books to come.
Mm.
Like I'd have to wait for them for like a week, and I'd be in suspense, just like trying to devour as much information as possible. But then with the iPad, I could instantly go down this rabbit hole. One of the obsessions that I developed was with Ellen DeGeneres, and also with the gay rights movement more broadly that was going on around that time, around 2012. I thought Ellen was super likable. She dressed in a way that was very cool. Like she had short hair, and I thought that was cool. Like I was used to women having shorter hair. I wasn't used to women wearing like more of that kind of menswear style. And, I was trying to figure out like kind of how do I want to dress because I was very uncomfortable in my clothes. I didn't like the way they felt. I didn't like the way they looked. The girls my age, they were around seventh grade starting to wear like low cut shirts, tighter clothes, tons of makeup, things that I could never see myself wearing. Like that one sounds like a lot of work, two just looks very uncomfortable, and three, I was just like, yeah, no way in hell, I'm not going to do that. So I was sort of in that phase, identity building, trying to figure out, who am I and what is my place in society? Very normal questions, for a 12-year-old to engage in. So yeah, like I was obsessed with Ellen. I was obsessed with the gay rights movement. So I would watch clips of that, of the Ellen DeGeneres show and whatnot on YouTube. And I think that really the algorithm started to feed me more content that wasn't just about gays and lesbians, but also about, the whole transgender issue because of course back then it was still like LGBT, like that had already been in the works for I guess about 20 years when, because from my understanding there was the lesbian and gay movement, and then around the 90s the bisexuals and the transsexuals were added together, so this was this, it became this kind of LGBT community. And so, of course, the algorithm started to feed me more of this trans content. Before then, I was familiar with the idea of a transsexual because I grew up in a progressive West Coast city. So I'd see people who were very obviously male, but were, wearing women's clothes and had breast implants. And so I sort of asked my parents, like, is this a boy or a girl? And, it was explained to me very much as like, there are some people who have like a female soul inside of a male body, but the claim was never made that they were literally women. And, on the radio, they talk about transsexuals as well. They talk about hermaphrodites as they were back then. I remember when the shift to intersex started to happen, I guess around the late kind of 2000s maybe. And for a while, before I thought I was trans, I thought maybe I'm a hermaphrodite because I had all these really odd characteristics, and I just thought, well, certainly there has to be some explanation for it. I was always trying to figure out why. Like why I was the way I was, why other people are the way they are. I was waiting in what the algorithm fed me, starting from Ellen DeGeneres and the gay rights movement to like the trans movement. And I started to see a lot of these like young women who were, I don't know, about 10, 15 years older than I was. And they would basically film themselves transforming from young women into people who very much look like men. They would talk about this process. Many times they would bind their breasts on camera with ace bandages. And then, of course, some of them said, "No, you can't do the ace bandage. That's dangerous." And so they'd get their Underworks binders. Underworks was like big back in those days.
Yep.
So they would bind their breasts on camera and they would do these testosterone injections and kind of talk about the changes. And a lot of them would discuss like how they came to understand that they were trans. They would talk about basically, being my age. And they would talk about like having discomfort, embodied discomfort. They would talk about how like, oh, I thought I was just a butch lesbian. And then I realized, no, like actually butch lesbians are just trans men who like haven't realized that they're trans. Lesbians are like okay with being women. That they're okay with like doing normal like woman things. But like I realized that, I was different. Some of them would start to kind of construct this narrative of like, They were these kind of miserable, lonely butch lesbians. They'd wear men's clothes because those are the styles they liked, and their clothes wouldn't fit very well. They would say I looked awkward, I felt awkward. It was kind of hard to get girlfriends and then I realized that actually I'm not a woman at all. And that really I was just like a straight man the entire time. Basically, the narrative that was constructed by, people who were maybe 10, 12, 15 years older than I was, I found that narrative to be significantly more compelling
And how
than
old, and
the,
how,
yeah.
sorry, just to interject really quick. And how old were you at this point when you were
Yeah.
watching these sort of trans influencers?
Yeah, I was 12.
Okay, okay, so just kind of on the
Yeah.
brink of being a teenager, preteen.
Yeah, well, I mean, technically for girls, adolescence has a very strict start date, which is the beginning of the period. So
Right, and
that's
you
when
were so much
adolescence is actually like
earlier.
biologically for females defined. I was 10, yeah, when I got my period, which was pretty horrendous. Um, and very
Yeah.
painful as well. I mean, yeah, like so that definitely contributed to feeling very uncomfortable in my female body. I mean, there are so many sensory changes that kind of accompany puberty. I think that a lot of reasons why these kids who are kind of neurodivergent, so-called, and this could include traits of ADHD and traits of autism and maybe some others, like the really cerebral type of kid, very brainy, who like puberty forces you to become embodied. So if you go from being a very cerebral child and then you hit puberty, there are like new smells, there are new feelings, including crushes, which I didn't know what crushes were. I mean, I thought that crush was an orange soda in a supermarket. I didn't understand that there were, all these feelings associated with it. Not nebulous feelings, but embodied feelings. So, I mean, of course, when I had my first crush, also when I was 12, I didn't know what to do with it, right? Like I was in class, I was in my Arabic class and we were passing a stack of worksheets down the classroom and my hand like briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates and I started to like feel all these really odd sensations in my body. Like my heart rate sped up, I began to perspire, my body was warm, and I look at her and I'm trying to, I want to say something to her. Like I want to apologize to her, because our hands, brushed each other and like no words came out. No words. And she smiled at me and then the feelings got even more intense. And so naturally, right, as a kid, I thought I was dying because, like, based on all the medical research I'd done, a word that I used often when I was 12 was homeostasis, right? I knew that there was like a certain state of being that we tend to exist in, and because I was 12, I came to the very immature conclusion that any deviation away from homeostasis is a sign of pathology. So I then went down this search of like, what pathology am I suffering from now? So I went on to WebMD and I started typing in all of my symptoms, and of course, WebMD told me that I either had like a cold or the flu or like a slew of different neuro like degenerative diseases that would kill me pretty shortly. So then I became really paranoid about like, I'm 12 and am I gonna die? I did realize at some point that whatever disease I was suffering from, it only showed up when I was like in close proximity with girls, like specific girls. And so I was like, okay, like I'm just gonna like hang out with the boys. My brain wasn't doing all these weird things when I was around them. I could just function like a normal person. I'd start hanging out with this group of boys and we'd like start to pull pranks on the teachers. And if we didn't get caught, right, like the girls would laugh. And so we were kind of trying to get their attention. And this was all like without me realizing what I was doing. So the girls that, I was trying to get their attention by pulling these pranks on the teachers, they would start to pair off with like my male friends and I'd never get the girls. And so I just like remember thinking like, oh my God, like I can't get this girl's attention. And it's because I'm a girl. It's because I'm not a boy. And there were just a lot of, aspects of that entire situation that also contributed to my feeling of wrongness in like being a girl, and in my body. And also like because I wanted to dress more like my male peers. Like it was
Mhm.
all around the same time when I was trying to figure out like how do I want to dress? Who do I want to be? I started to realize that I'm different. My parents realized that I wasn't picking up on social cues. They thought that this is something that I would outgrow, naturally, but I really didn't. And so they were trying to teach me all of these different aspects of social interaction. Like, hey, like if you talk to people, you can't just talk at them for 2 hours. Like you can't just go on these rants. You have to ask them questions. So that was news
Mm.
to me, and I was like, okay, cool. I didn't know that. So I tried to figure out how to ask people questions, and So I'd go on a little rant about like my favorite brain tumor of the week, and then I'd ask them, well, like, what's your favorite brain tumor? And they of course wouldn't have one because we're talking about, your normative 12-year-old. I was trying to figure out also how to socially interact, and there are differences in how you're supposed to interact with boys versus girls. And girls are very complicated. Like, especially when they hit puberty, the rules in these like female friendship groups, they become exponentially more complicated. Like the emotional maneuvers, the kind of intrasexual competition of like trying to drag down some girls in the group to try to lift yourself up. Like there are all of these social nuances that happen within female friend
Hmm.
groups. And I was never in female friend groups really. I kind of observed them from afar and was just very confused. So I was also like, yeah, I can't relate to this class of human beings. They're very complicated. They don't make any sense. And I feel really weird feelings when I'm around them. There was just like, I guess, a lot going on in that moment. And I was also consuming this trans content. Like it wasn't like from the moment that I started watching these trans influencers that I thought I was trans. It was more like from the moment I started watching these trans influencers, I was just cataloging all this information and I found it fascinating. I was obsessed with the surgeries because I was obsessed with other surgeries like gastric bypass operations. I was fascinated with just with the kind of techniques of these operations. And so I knew that there were like different techniques for the so-called top surgeries. Obviously, there were different surgeries based on sex. And I knew that, that there were also multiple options within each. So
Yeah.
I started learning kind of all at the same time. I was learning like, if you have larger breasts, like, you're gonna probably have to get the double incision mastectomy
Right.
with the scars.
Hmm.
And then, versus the keyhole procedure, which is basically just kind of a liposuction. So I was cataloging away all this information. And, as I was experiencing these kind of psychosocial dynamics and shifts at school, that were really highlighting the extent of my neurodivergence, at school, like as I was engaging in this little prank brigade with my friends and not getting the girls that my friends were getting, I began to feel like actual loneliness, I guess for the first time in my life. Because before then, I was very happy to exist on my own planet. But it was around that age when I started to realize, like, actually, there are other people in the world that I do want to interact with them and I do want to get to know them better. And there's something preventing me from it. I realized that I just didn't fit in neatly to any category, frankly. Like I was a very atypical girl. And I wasn't a boy. Like biologically, certainly I wasn't a boy, but in many ways I was much more similar to my male peers. Like in some ways it was a very rational calculus. Like I like to wear those types of clothes. You know, I related to them in a lot of ways, and I felt kind of like an alien. I really began to think like maybe like I am trans. It's very possible that I might have just been born in the wrong body and that this explains it. The more of this content I was consuming, the more I really started to see myself in these narratives of these younger women. For me, it certainly wasn't just a simple thing of like I found the concept of a trans man and I thought, yeah, that's me. It's like no, no, no. For me, it was like I found this concept and I was interested in it from like the kind of technomedical aspect, right? I was interested in brains. I was interested in different glands in the body. I was interested in surgeries. Like it
Hmm.
wasn't just an identity exploration. But anyways, like the more of these trans influencers I watched, there was part of me that explored it intellectually. And then there was part of me that was like, emotionally kind of driven to accept these narratives, not just in the abstract, but for myself personally. And it had to do with all these kind of difficulties and kind of psychosocial differences that I was experiencing around that time. And I kind of had come to the conclusion of like, I don't know why I'm so different from the girls. I don't know how it could be anything but this. Like this has to
Hmm.
be the explanation. And so I really latched onto this and I basically, I started delving into the stories of trans kids and there were stories of like of Jazz Jennings, and there were some others. And this is all when I was 12, like before I even told my parents that I was trans or that I thought I was trans. And in these documentaries about trans kids, what I was finding is like, they were basically saying if you don't like they wouldn't use the word affirm back then. That wasn't a word that they used. They would say support. Like if you don't support your kid in the transition, then it means there's a really high likelihood of suicide. And that you need to get this done early because, like in the case of boys, I mean, the reason why gender medicine exists, like it really to account for the cases of these very non-conforming young boys. Because, if you believe in the premises of gender medicine, the way that you can, help someone resolve their psychological distress is by intervening in their physical body. if you believe those premises and you believe that this condition of transsexualism is not the creation of a technomedical complex, but is some kind of innate state which needs to be treated with technomedicine, if you like buy all of these premises, which I fundamentally don't, but I did at the time, then it makes sense that you believe like, okay, yeah, there is such a thing as a transsexual adult, that is some kind of like metaphysical category. Well, then
Mhm.
certainly, and these transsexual adults talk about having these feelings from a young age. Well, then it follows by logical extension that there is such a thing as a transsexual child, a juvenile
Right.
transsexual, as they would have been called in the Netherlands, and the trans kid, as they would be called in the United States. At first, I'd come into contact with the stories of these adults, and then the more of the stories of the adults that I kind of consumed, there were more of these stories of kids. And so like I thought I must be, like one of these kids. And if I don't tell my parents, immediately and they don't put me on puberty blockers, like I've already been in puberty for a few years, the chances that I'm going to be able to like pass as a man in adulthood are going to be limited. And when you're a kid, you really have this very rigid thinking. Like you really don't see this kind of third pathway of just being like a gender non-conforming member of your own sex. And so once I like latched on to the trans framework, I started to plan my entire future on it. And so I was thinking like, okay, I need to follow whatever roadmap these people online are telling me that I need to follow so that once I become an adult, this is not like going to be something I struggle with. Like so that I
Hmm.
can find some place in society that makes sense. So I can fit in somewhere. Maybe like 4 or 5 months before I was going to turn 13, I basically came out to my parents as trans in 2012, and they were very shocked. Like they were totally shocked. They basically made it clear that they were not going to affirm or anything of that matter. And so, I would really fight to have the more masculine hairstyles that I wanted to and the clothing styles. But there was, when they refused to affirm, I felt sort of hopeless in a way, right? Because I had come to this entire plan of how my life was going to play out. And because my parents were a massive roadblock in that, I had to kind of reevaluate everything.
Well, I super actually relate to like a lot of what you were saying about like planning your life out as like a teen or preteen, and then your parents like not affirming. And I was born in the early 90s, and I believe you were born in like the late 90s. And so I think a huge
99.
so almost in the 21st century, but still a 90s baby. I think the big difference, one of the big differences is the puberty blockers kind of being a part of public consciousness at the time that you were a preteen versus like when I was, which was 8 or 9 years prior. I didn't know that puberty blockers existed when I talked to my parents. Like I didn't think there was really anything I could do until after they didn't affirm me. It's not like I was asking for puberty blockers. It was more like okay, I'm gonna wait till I'm an adult type of thing. Like there's nothing I can do to stop puberty, but I can do this stuff later. Like the idea of transitioning as a child, I guess, just like never came up. So that's, I think a big difference in just the shift between like the last, 10 years, that 10 years in between or so. And then you said this like quite a while ago, but you mentioned having an iPad as like a kid or preteen. For me, I think the iPhone came out when I was like a senior in high school, junior or senior in high
Wow.
school. Yeah, so I didn't have that access to technology in the same way. Like I did have like a computer that I could log into like once a day, but it wasn't, it wasn't just constantly on your person, like it was for like your generation. And I don't want to like divert the conversation too much, but I did want to ask you, other than, the puberty blockers and obviously the changes in technology, why do you think that your generation has such an affinity for this gender identity ideology? Because it seems to be far more common in your generation than even mine, which is when I think it's kind of first started to sort of take off with younger millennials, but then Gen Z, it's just like another level.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate you asking this question, because I think it's important why my generation, why it is that Gen Z has become the trans generation. And in fact, I've actually written an entire piece about this on Substack, which I also think is called like, Why did Gen Z become the trans generation? And from my assessment, There are a lot of different reasons. Like there have been some pretty massive shifts in parenting that kind of lean more towards like helicopter parenting. And what you can see this kind of both within the immigrant sort of tiger parents, and you can also see helicopter parenting within the very typical American or Western kind of lackadaisical bubble wrap parenting, where like there, but in both cases, and it's not just all parents, it's specifically parents who are wealthier, maybe middle class, upper middle class. They have fewer kids, they have more money, they invest, more per child. And so they really their kids become their kind of project. Whereas before, like, when these Gen X parents were being raised, it was like there would probably be more kids in a family. And so, and there was more of this norm of just sending your kids out to play, like, and come home when the streetlights come on. Like my generation didn't experience that. For us, it was very much like our parents put us in a bunch of extracurricular activities. So we'd have school, and then we'd maybe, like in my case, there was a lot of tutoring and a lot of different therapies because I had all these developmental issues. Like I wore leg braces as a kid for some time. I had some speech issues. I had all kinds of random issues, right? So I would be in different types of therapy at different types of doctor's appointments. But then I'd also be at a lot of extracurricular activities trying to really kind of bulk up my strengths. And this is very common for my generation, regardless of whether or not you're a kid who has developmental difficulties. The Gen X parents of Gen Z kids, especially those who are more well off, they'll put their kids, in a carousel of kind of adult facilitated activities.
Mm.
Different like music lessons, drama, sports, tutoring, all these different, chess, gymnastics, whatever it is, right? Parents will be like kind of pre-planning their kids' schedules and even time for social interaction. Like it's done in the form of a play date, in the form of the parent is facilitating when and how their child interacts. There's no like kids barely play outside anymore. And if they are, like it'll be one or two, maybe siblings riding their bikes, but there aren't just like people walking through suburbia can see this for themselves. Like there aren't just groups of kids playing together anymore. And the reason I think this is significant really is because like the reason why Gen X parents who are more well off, I think are doing this is because they perhaps felt like their needs weren't being met by their parents. Like their parents might have even been kind of neglectful. And like, the fact that TV shows had to put on the TV, it's 9 p.m., where are your kids? Like I
Mm.
can imagine that from that kid's perspective, the kid who is now the Gen X parent, I can imagine that from their perspective, they thought like my parents just tossed me to the wolves. There were all these missing kids like on the milk cartons. There were some significant drawbacks to totally being a latchkey kid. I mean, for a lot of kids it was great because they wouldn't go missing or get like seriously injured. But there would be some for whom like there were really catastrophic outcomes because their parents weren't paying attention. And so when Gen X had their own kids, they kind of overcorrected, in my opinion, by totally coddling their kids and totally bubble wrapping their kids. And they convinced their kids, that the world is a dangerous place. Kids who were born, like I was born in 99, but kids who were born around when I was born, and then in the few years after, there was this like kind of interesting dynamic where our childhoods would have been relatively free of technology. We were more similar to 90s kids in that there was like a home computer and a television, but there weren't smartphones in our early years. But then, like, as we hit this really vulnerable psychosocial period, then, parents started to get those first smartphones. And it was more affordable to get things like iPads for kids and personal computers, the laptops. And then as I hit my teenage years, sort of 13, 14, smartphones were becoming less expensive. And so you could start to get them for your kids. And then, instead of having a dumb phone to contact the kids, you'd give your kid a smartphone. So now they had an internet connected device with them at all times. So there were like shifts in parenting. These kids developed basically none of the skills that they would need to handle the trials and tribulations of adolescence. If they're in these kind of adult facilitated activities that, yes, do give them skills, like they do learn chess, they do learn gymnastics, they do learn writing, they do learn math, they do learn how to play sports at a high level. When you're parenting your kids in this typical kind of upper middle class Gen X style, you are giving your kids a lot of hard skills right? And confidence in their ability to like learn these hard skills and master these hard skills. But what you're not giving your kids is like this kind of peer-to-peer understanding, like, how do we occupy ourselves when we're bored? Right? Because being bored can be pretty distressing. And usually that's what facilitates kids to develop their own activities. They'll figure out, okay, how do I go over to this other kid's house and ask his parents if we can play outside in the old world, right? Like,
Right.
before my time, maybe in your time, kids actually had to come up with their own activities. They had to entertain themselves. They met up with other kids. They would do risky stuff. They would fall off a tree. They'd, best case scenario, skin their knee. Worst case scenario, really like break a bone or something. And they would learn how to tolerate physical pain. They'd learn how to tolerate distress. They'd have to figure out, how do I hobble my way back home and scream at my mom and get her to take me to the emergency room or whatever it is. Like, there were really important skills that kids of your generation developed that would help you when you hit puberty, when there was this, like, you'd have bonds with peers, you'd have a friend group that you would like engage in embodied play with. Like, there was imaginative play in the younger years that happened when kids were just kind of allowed to hang out with each other and play. They'd come up
Mhm.
with their own imaginary games, so they'd be playing dress up and doing stuff like that, with other peers at an appropriate age. But when this is not happening, when like this imaginative play skill, when you don't do it when you're like 2, 3, 4, 5, you're missing out on all of those important skills of figuring out like how to interact with other people and how to figure out like who are you versus like these characters whose costumes you're putting on. So if kids aren't doing that, especially with other kids, and they're not like playing house, and they're not playing these risky games where they could get hurt
Mhm.
when they're young, when they're not doing that, yes, you may be saving them from a broken arm or a skinned knee, but what you are robbing from them fundamentally is the ability to like start to develop independence and really important skills. And so what happened to my generation is that we might have had some of those skills developed,
Mhm.
but we never really got to do it in an unstructured way. Like, we never got to figure out like how to deal with pain, how to deal with discomfort, especially because even if you're a parent who kind of sees the value in the hard knock life, a bunch of other parents in your kid's school are not going to be like that. And so that's where you get
Yeah.
the Karen phenomenon, where these parents, like, they think their kids are the bee's knees, super special. And yes, to every parent, their kid is super special. But what ends up happening is, like, because you don't want your kid to get hurt or to feel pain, emotional or physical, then obviously with competitive sports, even the activities that parents can shuttle their kids to, those activities become much more centered around coddling. Because, like, there's one type of pain that's really important to learn from, and it's the fear of it's like the pain that comes from failure and from losing. And so that you start to get the participation trophies because there's this shift in parenting. Like, it goes from being like, parents being totally uninvolved to parents being super involved in every aspect of their kids' lives, making sure that your kid never experiences pain or hardship. They need to have this magical Disneyfied childhood. And that's just not how anything works. And so these parents, these Karen parents, would go to the schools and they'd really lobby for this, like, our kids we need to have participation trophies because it's so damaging to their self-esteem to lose and it makes them feel inadequate. So there are all these kind of totally false out there notions about what is actually necessary for kids to be resilient and successful. Because instead of parenting kids for success, these wealthier parents started to parent their kids for happiness, with happiness being the end goal. I really think it's pretty catastrophic to have happiness be the goal of any parenting strategy because the things that make kids happy are short-term things
Mhm.
because kids don't think in the long term. They're not cognitively there. Like, their prefrontal cortices are not developed until their mid to late 20s in a typical case. And when we're talking about like what makes a kid happy, it is like eating ice cream for dinner every single day. It's eating cookies, right? It's like, watching TV all day. It's not doing their math homework. It's not like, that's the role of the parent. The role of the parent is saying like, okay, the things that make us happy are really good rewards. But we can't parent for constant reward. Like, there are just things that you have to do in life that you don't want to do. And it sucks, and you kind of have to learn to do it if you want to be a
Mhm.
functioning member of society. Like, that's the role of a parent. It's not to neglect their kids and send them off and just let them do whatever the hell. But it's also not just like only letting your kids have like this little taste of independence when you've shuttled them off to this like parent planned activity because then they learn no skills that are really necessary for them to like, actually function as adults. They might be math geniuses, right? They might be really gifted artists or writers, but if they lose a competition, they've never had to deal with loss. So it breaks them, it shatters them. And the thing is that like puberty is inherently difficult. There's no way of getting out of the difficulties of puberty. It just is a naturally sucky process. And so these parents, when they have the puberty talk with their kids, they'll talk about the physical changes. They'll talk about like, how puberty happens in the body. They'll talk about that type of stuff. Very rarely, in my experience, will they talk about how much puberty sucks. Because puberty really, really
Mm.
sucks. Like, there's no way around it. And they don't tell their kids that puberty sucks. They haven't given their kids any opportunities to develop the emotional resilience to where puberty just sucks and you get over it. Like,
Right,
it's a catastrophe for these kids because they've built zero emotional resilience. And so their kids go in this totally blind, unequipped. They think that they're the only ones for whom puberty sucks because there's very little emotional honesty out of fear. So there's this entire shift in parenting culture. And then you add devices into it, and then naturally, a kid who has no social skills or very few social skills, who is very talented in certain areas, but just does not know really how to engage with other people, like they're going to be pretty confused. And then you have this device, and so they become totally secluded in these online forums. Kids really are not meant to be raised by a computer. This is just a perfect storm, right? Like there's a reason why it was Gen Z that latched on because of this massive shifts in parenting, shifts in technology, like our attitudes about child rearing going from kind of parent led to being totally child centered, right? And a lot of parents who, especially parents of kids who are, younger than I am, maybe by 5, 6, 7 years, instead of it just being like, okay, we're going to shuttle our kids off to these different activities, it became like, we don't actually know what's best for our kids. Parents totally stopped trusting their instincts. They totally stopped
mm,
and they started like deferring to experts. Like they started to think like, if I don't have a degree in child psychology, it means that I am somehow inadequate. I am not equipped to parent my kids without fundamentally messing them up. And
right,
so parents were given this sense of insecurity by like this growing parenting industry, and it screwed these parents because like they totally stopped listening to their instincts and they started outsourcing more of their parenting to experts. And so when their kids started to experience these psychosocial difficulties, it was suddenly, oh my God, my kid has some kind of pathology. My kid, has autism or ADHD or, anxiety, depression. We need to get them on meds, 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 meds. And again, the groundwork of this was laid when you were growing up in like the 90s and even sooner, maybe in
yeah,
the late 80s, where we started to medicalize childhood. But like this whole thing evolved. Like this, we didn't just get here out of nowhere. And so then the trans framework comes in, right? The reason why the trans framework, I think, has become like Gen Z's form of individuation and rebellion, there are many reasons. The first of which is that the claims of gender ideology, the claims that if you feel uncomfortable in your body, if you feel that your body is wrong, which basically every kid around puberty will feel, it means that it is therefore literally correct that your body is, in some metaphysical sense, wrong. So that
right,
belief exists. And then what's the inroad to the trans framework, right? Discomfort around puberty, gender nonconformity, like whether you have a history of gender confusion or nonconformity or whether you don't. If you say you're trans, you are trans. So it's really easy to get in, right? And,
yeah,
and like if you're miserable, it promises that there's this way out of your misery, out of your misery. So it becomes very tantalizing to the kid. And because they're not doing this, like they're not building their identities in real life, they're building their identities online in the abstract. None of it is embodied. Like they're not building their sense of self based on I'm failing here and I'm succeeding here. I'm a good person. That's how normally teenagers would have developed their identities. Trial and error through like they'd find their group in school, the jocks, the nerds, the preppy kids, goth, whatever it was. I feel like I'm speaking a foreign language because that's not how my generation did it. My generation individuated and tried to find its collective identity within pathology. Gen Z
mm,
totally sees itself in the realm of pathology, like normal personality traits. We don't even say like Bobby is shy. We say Bobby has social anxiety. We don't say
right,
I'm sad. We say I'm depressed. I'm suffering from depression, right? We don't say like, oh, he's energetic. We say he has ADHD. She's quirky. She's eccentric. We say no, no, she's autistic. So
yeah,
personality traits, because you would normally like anything. where you would normally develop an understanding of yourself as an individual, as a person with a personality, it would come through actual activities. It would come, yeah, it would have to be, it has to be embodied. But for like my generation and for those who are younger than me, there's nothing embodied about the way we were raised. Not beyond our early years for people who were born in the late 90s and early 2000s. And for kids these days, it's like, it's hard for parents to even get the kid away from the iPad and into sports. And so like there's this thing that's happening where my generation, we're in many ways we're so normal. We're normal kids and teenagers and young adults. We are trying to individuate. Our brains are primed to be less with our parents and more with our friends. And a lot of the parents will take that as like a personal attack against them. Like, my kid has adopted a trans identity and now they want nothing to do with me. And it's like, well, actually, your kid has adopted a trans identity because they're an adolescent and because they're trying to individuate. And your kid just wants to figure out who they are and they need to because they're a teenager. But obviously, when this framework enters the picture, the stakes of it are so high. Like parents can't just let it go, right? Because the stakes of it, the medical implications and the fact that it's being pushed from every single angle, the stakes are really, really high. And so like it has this like tendency to blow up the family, and parents seem to think that this trans thing is just so different, so fundamentally different from other types of like teenage identity exploration, when the way I see it is like the gender identity framework, it's a sense-making mechanism. Like these Gen X parents as teenagers, they might have found that same type of like guidance and meaning and framework within religion or within like, I don't know, astrology or tarot reading. And for Gen Z, it's all kinds of pathology. If you can find it in the DSM, that's how Gen Z does its tarot. That's how, I mean, Gen Z will also do tarot, because again, it's about making sense of things. There's a reason why we see a specific type of kid getting into this. Like the kid is archetypically Gen Z for the reasons I mentioned, right? Like they don't have these skills to truly individuate from their parents. And so they pick a rebellion that requires their parents to buy into it. Like they're not sneaking out to party, to drink, to have casual sex. We know this from the statistics. They're individuating in a way that actually requires their parents to get along, to get on board, to use the names and pronouns. Like
Right.
it's a very fundamentally different type of, I guess, rebellion, if you want to call it, because they're not rebelling against society. Society's become very postmodern, right? All the categories are queered. There's no boundary between kids and adults, between boys and girls, between good and evil. There are no boundaries there. Nothing is set in stone. And so you have these postmodern frameworks, and then you have this like kind of neo-Marxist framework that is basically saying, well, there is good and evil, and it's on the basis of oppressor versus oppressed. So like we've abandoned basically everything we know to be true about kids, everything we know about like what makes people develop successfully and functionally. We've thrown that all out, because, especially in American culture, because there's the idea of like if it's newer, that means it's therefore better. There's not a lot of value placed on tradition. And so like there are all these like confounding variables. And what ends up happening is that this kid, they're miserable. They don't have life skills. It's hard for them to relate to other kids their own age. They feel like they're odd. And oftentimes they are odd. A lot of them have like neurodivergent traits. And if they're so high functional, they'll never get diagnosed with them. And this
Right.
generation that needs diagnosis to understand itself, it becomes this whole mess where this framework basically makes sense of their developmental misery. Their parents are like so worried about them sneaking out and partying, maybe getting some like illicit alcohol or whatever. Where actually, frankly, if you think about it, the risks are pretty low for that. I mean, they'll drink too much alcohol, they'll throw up, But if you take like these other types of risks that Gen Z wants to take with its health, like transition, parents are much more willing to accept that type of risk-taking behavior. And so is Gen Z, frankly. Like there's a reason why a lot of parents of Gen Z kids are affirming. And it's because they trust the experts. They've been told to trust the experts. And they think, okay, yeah, sure, some of this is experimental, but if it's happening in a sterile like environment of a gender clinic, then it's safe.
Mm.
And that's also the reason why Gen Z thinks that like, taking these types of mind-altering substances is going to be safe. They want a rebellion that they perceive to be safe. What's left when you have no skills, like you don't know how to drive and you don't know how to like call someone on the phone because it gives you anxiety. So you can't organize, okay, we're going to sneak out and we're going to go to this party, right? Like if you don't have those skills to rebel, but you still have this developmental requirement of individuating, often through rebellion. And then you have
Mm.
this framework that's become very ubiquitous, that's kind of being pushed from every institution. And it's like astrology, right? It's full of Barnum statements. It's full of statements that are so vast and so wide that nearly anyone could see themselves as being trans within this framework, and it promises you so many things. It's not even saying like there's a specific type of person who would benefit from this pathway, and we can know this clinically. Gender medicine kind of used to make those claims, and those claims were pretty unsubstantiated. But now, like, they're saying you don't even need dysphoria to be trans. And because these kids can so easily see themselves within this framework, they latch onto it. And so their rebellion ends up taking the form of like, totally disowning their identity, their previous identity. And usually you'd only see this like in patients who are really traumatized, like, the multiple personality disorder stuff. But now you're seeing this as happening in Gen Z all the time because, like, because this framework that they're adopting, it doesn't just rationalize their developmental discomfort. It tells them to become an entirely new person as a way to remedy their developmental discomfort. There's this ideation phase. Like we talk about transition mostly, we talk about medical transition, we talk a bit about social transition, not even remotely enough, in my opinion, because it is such an important phase. But like there's this ideation phase, the one that I just described, with my life and getting the iPad and going through this thought process of who am I, where am I. This ideation phase perfectly coincides with normal developmental task of adolescence, and it's a type of rebellion that requires their parents to get on board. And if the parents don't get on board, it's a catastrophe. It's a total catastrophe, right, for these kids. And it's because they again have developed zero emotional resilience to deal with disappointment because it's possible that no one has ever put down a boundary for these kids before because the parenting culture tells parents that if you put down a boundary, you're somehow oppressing your kid. And the kid believes that message as well because all of these narratives around gender ideology and about affirmation are also based entirely on parenting of Gen Z kids, like the gentle parenting and the,
Mm,
and the child-centered or child-led permissive parenting. Most of the parents, in my experience, who affirm, they start out as skeptics. Like they are skeptical when the doctor says this kid like actually was a boy the entire time. Like this girl who you dressed in princess costumes, who was very happy about it, actually is a boy. You need to
hmm
affirm this. You need to put her on all these drugs that are pretty experimental. Most parents start out as being very skeptical, but then these clinicians will use like the dead son or a living daughter argument, and it's total emotional blackmail. And these parents, this obviously stresses them out. Hearing that, I mean, it would stress out any parents. And then comes in the element of emotional resilience, right? Where like these parents will often, no matter how skeptical and intelligent they are, just agree. They'll agree. They'll say whatever it takes because like they've parented their kid in such a way as to minimize the child's negative emotional reactions. And so when their kid does react negatively, the parent is not used to it. And so the parent freaks out, and then everyone's panicking. And I find that both parents, whether they affirm or whether they don't affirm, a lot of it is based on panic. A lot of these parenting strategies are based on panic. And so it's like it becomes this entire like snowball. And so like yeah, I just think there are so many reasons why Gen Z has gotten into trans. Those are just a few of them, and I know I've spoken for I don't know if any of this was coherent, but
No, no,
I'll just
definitely.
yeah,
I
I'll
mean, you
just I'll
actually
wrap it
covered
in.
you covered like multiple questions I was going to ask. I just wanted to comment on as you were talking about this shift in parenting styles and also sort of the lack of play, different types of play that were normal for kids for generations prior to technology sort of infiltrating the the family dynamic and the peer dynamic between kids. I just kind of thought about this phenomenon of how the trans community can be very like infantilizing. Like, you have 20, 30, 35-year-olds, calling themselves like trans girls and trans boys. And just the dress is very a lot of times very young. Like you see a lot of these female to male trans influencers, kind of they're going for more of a teenage boy type of look rather than like a adult man. And same thing with like the trans identified males. They're dressing in a style that's very reminiscent of childhood and like teen years rather than being like an adult member of the opposite sex. And yeah, just the interactions that I see on TikTok and their way of speaking, everything, it's almost like they didn't go through childhood in the same way that previous generations did. And then the parenting style of kind of always feeling like you need your parents' approval and like you're still kind of in this child position even as an adult. It's just very interesting. And just when you were talking, that light bulb kind of went off of like, oh, this maybe could kind of explain this phenomenon that we're seeing with the trans community.
I think that's a really astute observation. Like the childhood and adolescence being extended because those milestones weren't met in a more appropriate time frame. And
Mhm.
also you see like a lot of it with like this autism spectrum stuff. Like whereas a kid who doesn't have these traits might be able to cope a little bit better, with this totally disembodied childhood. And we know they aren't, right? But theoretically, like the reason why some Gen Z kids go trans versus other Gen Z kids will like develop some other maladaptive coping mechanism for their adolescent woes. I think that the linchpin there is usually like autism, um, maybe trauma, like definitely trauma, and then there's these other traits, right? Personality traits that we know predispose someone more to kind of latching onto this identity simply because of the fact that we see them in gender clinics. I'm not a clinician, right? Like, but we see the statistics, all of us, about like the high rates of autism, and we already know
Right.
that autistic young people are going to have developmental delays, like almost certainly. It's not part of the diagnostic criteria, but it's so highly comorbid that it's like, there's going to be this like intellectual intelligence that really outpaces the emotional intelligence, and that's without the internet. Then you add the internet to it, and it makes both of those things worse. Like that disconnect, that sort of incongruence, so to speak, between the intellectual intelligence and the emotional intelligence even higher because you can
Right.
digest all this information, but you're not actually like, you know, at the emotional level of understanding where it's possible for you to kind of contextualize this and think like, oh yeah, these people aren't literally changing their sex. You know, living in this life of kind of cross-sex impersonation comes with a lot of challenges. Like transition comes with a lot of challenges, physically and like psychologically and psychosocially. So these kids are like they're way too young to be encountering these ideas and to hold them with any kind of perspective. And yet they're the ones who are supposed to be in the driver's seat. And so it's just creating this entire, labyrinth. And yeah, like I think the way that you talk about like the styles of dress. That's one indication of it. Also, the stuffed animals. Like it's very common, both with men and with women who identify as trans, to be like very attached to certain stuffed animals. And so, it's pretty clear that like there's a certain level of emotional resilience that was not acquired in development simply, and it's not the fault of any of these trans identifying young people or any other Gen Zer who like even isn't trans identified, but who still like is lagging developmentally, like when you kind of juxtapose them against their parents, it's really because of this entire culture that we've created.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were born in the US, correct? And raised in the United States. And then so basically just tell us the rest of your story in terms of how you ended up living in Israel, what made you choose to go there, and what was your experience of transition and living as the opposite sex or as a trans person in Israel?
Yeah. So basically, I came out to my parents as trans when I was 12. They were shocked, they were panicked. So the conversation did not, I don't think it was handled in the best way. And it made me pretty hesitant to, ever talk to my parents about emotions ever again. And, like when parents panic, right, like the kids panic even more. And I think that plays out not just in my family, but in basically every single family that is touched by this issue. And so I really just like incubated my feelings for, throughout my adolescence. None of the root causes about why I thought that I should have been born a boy, why I thought I was in the wrong body, like zero of those causes were addressed because there was never an interrogation of like, why do you feel this way? It was just like, this is insane. This is ridiculous. This is just a phase. We're not going to have this. Right. And so, like anything that was even remotely associated with transition off the table, it was pretty hard for me to, experiment with the types of sort of clothing styles and haircuts that I wanted to. It was just there was so much tension around basic self-expression as well, because I, expressed my kind of confusion and my desire to engage in those types of things kind of through the trans script, because it was the only
Mhm.
script I had And so my parents kind of understandably were like, "You're not a boy, so you're not gonna do any of this stuff." My parents tried. They tried to send me to a therapist in 2012, but no one would take my case. Like there were no therapists who knew what to do. There wasn't even this
Mm.
big in 2012, there wasn't even this big industry of gender affirming therapists. It just nothing existed. This was totally unheard of. Like either you'd have a 3-year-old, and if you were particularly neurotic about your 3-year-old son playing dressed up with his sisters, he might, take him to a gender clinic or take him to a child psychologist who would get him diagnosed with gender identity disorder and maybe socially transitioned, kind of like in Jazz's case. There wasn't yet this wave of preteen and teen girls, saying, I was born in the wrong body. There was no therapist who could help us. My parents were like, the internet is the problem. They took away the internet. And so I was the only person in the house who had restricted internet access. My parents were really trying to protect me, but like my desire to figure out what was wrong and how to fix it persisted, even though there was because there was no help, there was no addressing of the underlying issues. And frankly, the issues were, in my mind, pretty solvable. Like, I wasn't particularly traumatized. Like, yeah, there were some pretty bad things, that happened in my childhood that had nothing to do with my family. The types of transgression, I'll say, that happened to young girls, that certainly happened in kind of earlier
Mm.
years. But I wasn't, particularly traumatized, I don't think. Like I was mostly just extremely confused about puberty and about why I was the way I was. And so because of that, I still had this desire to consume more trans content because I thought if I can figure out how to make this work, if I can figure out how to transition, I've set myself up for adulthood. I'm going to fit in. I'm going to be a really high functioning member of society. I can live anywhere in the world. So I started to explore this stuff at the school library. Like there was internet at the school library. So I would do that. And for my last couple years in middle school, there weren't tons of like LGBT books in the library. There were a couple, but not a ton. And then, but there's the internet, and I would figure out where at the local bookstore, at the local library, I could find this content, and I would just read it in printed format. So I was really very stubborn. Like my parents were stubborn, and they were like, no, absolutely not. And I was just as stubborn, but I was desperate. Like they were panicking, I was panicking. It was not a good situation. So I kept spiraling within this trans content and being really sneaky about it. And also at the same time, I realized my parents won't let me go on puberty blockers, so I'm just gonna have to settle for the fact that I'm gonna be an adult man who's like 5'1" or whatever, 5'2". But what I might have control over is my breasts. And
Mm.
so I started to bind my breasts, first with like, ace bandages, but that was just, so uncomfortable and like I knew it was unsafe to do it, and so then I started figuring out, okay, like what can I bind with, that is going to be somewhat sustainable. And so like I started to layer on multiple sports bras because this was another suggestion from these trans influencers. So I did that for a very long time and I started to develop posture issues. And there was a lot of pressure around my ribs and it did enough compression to the point where I was like, okay, maybe if I can just do this, I can stop my breasts from further developing. And so then I'll be eligible for the keyhole procedure when I'm older and I won't have these
Mm.
scars, because I could foresee, like I had this almost psychic ability to foresee, like in 2012, these trans men were talking about like how if, the ones who had the mastectomy scars, they'd say, I'd be at the beach and sometimes people would ask me about why I have these scars. And I just told them that like I got into an accident, one of them joked about being bitten by a shark, another one joked about, you know, having gynecomastia, and then another one joked about like it's burn grafts, right? Like in 2012, you could have played off having scars on your chest and not
Right.
outing yourself because no one knew what these scars meant. But I could foresee, like I saw this getting more popular, and I knew that like I would not be able to use those same types of excuses as FTMs in the 2010s and before were able to use because it became obvious to me that this topic is gaining way more visibility and popularity. Like I was the type of trans person who saw trans visibility as being a fundamentally bad thing for trans people, right?
Hmm.
Because it impedes your ability to pass when everyone knows what to look for. So because I was binding my breasts with like these multiple sports bras, like I started to develop posture issues. So my parents took me to a chiropractor, and the chiropractor recommended that I get this type of back brace garment that was kind of like a sports bra, very tight, but it was supposed to put my shoulders in the right position. So this type of garment, I don't even know what it's called. Like I wore it constantly. I never took it off, not even to sleep. I took one shower once a week for like 10 minutes and I immediately put it right back on because I thought if I don't wear this around the clock, my breasts are going to continue to grow and then I'm going to have these scars across my chest and I'll never be able to pass as an adult.
Hmm.
So I wear this thing for years. And then, around my last, I don't know, year and a half of high school, I started to really want to date girls. And based on kind of the messages that I got from gender ideology and just from society in general, it's like, if you're a butch lesbian, or like just a more masculine lesbian, why would anyone be attracted to you? Like your partners might as well just be dating a man. Like you're going to be lonely and it's not attractive and all the lesbian representation. In order for it to go mainstream, they had to feature lesbian couples that are more conventional looking, like where both partners are more
Right.
feminine. Because that's how the gay rights movement got mainstream acceptance was showing straight people like we're like you. And so that type of representation was great for the gay rights movement. It wasn't great for like my generation of more gender nonconforming young people who are, experiencing some level of same-sex attraction, or just for gender nonconforming kids, even those who would grow up to be heterosexual. Like the only gender nonconformity that began to gain more media representation was this type of medicalized gender nonconformity. For a couple of years of high school, the last couple of years, there's just so much tension around all this stuff. And I started to develop so much shame around the fact that, I did like to dress in these more masculine ways, right? Because I started to get the message that it was really unacceptable to be a girl and to do these things. You can't be a girl and dress and behave in these ways. It means that you must be non-binary or a boy. I just thought like, well, I can't transition for the next couple years. And so like if I want to get a girlfriend, I can't keep dressing masculine. Like it's just there's no way to do it. I'm not going to get a girlfriend. And so I adopted a more feminine appearance. My parents were happy because they thought this gender thing was behind us. And I thought that maybe I can force myself to grow out of these feelings by dressing in a more typically feminine way. But really, I just felt like miserable all over again. Like there was a point, when I was dressing in a non-conforming way and had short hair and like my hair wasn't touching my neck and bothering me and my clothes weren't bothering me from a sensory perspective. And, I'd like go to debate tournaments and I'd wear bow ties and I felt like a little mini professor confidence, right? Like I was dressing up as something that I wanted to be, and really what I wanted to be was like a professor, or like a thought leader. And I felt so competent, but then I kept getting the messages that this is like really, really very unacceptable for girls. And so all
Hmm.
these things happened, and I was like, at least for the next couple of years, like I need to try being a girl, and wearing feminine clothes. I could never really stomach makeup. I never did that, but I grew out my hair and couldn't stand my hair all over again. I wanted to rip my hair out and I couldn't stand being embodied, right? Like I was doing something that was so totally inauthentic. But my parents were happy. They were like, "Okay, she's over the gender stuff. This is great." So they gave me a bit more freedom to do normal teenage things, right?
Hmm.
They were less worried about who I was hanging around, because they thought, okay, she's grown out of this, whatever. And I had some girlfriends and, who I'd see on the side, right? And I was happy in those relationships, but I was so fundamentally unhappy again in myself because I was like trying to embody this version of womanhood that was so inauthentic and it made me so miserable. And yet everyone around me was so happy because they saw that I'd blossomed into this beautiful young woman. And so there was like this new type of incongruence there where, I was like, if this is what it means to be a woman, I can't do it. I'm miserable. Like, if this is what it takes for everyone around me to be happy with me and for people to not ask me what my pronouns are every 2 seconds, if this is what it takes, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't do it. I'm miserable. And so I really came to the understanding by the end of high school that like I'm gonna go off to college and I'm gonna transition because I'm not cut out for being a woman. So I go to college, right? I begin my social transition. There's like a glitter family in my university, right? But like I wasn't entirely in the glitter family. Like there are a lot of toxic things about these glitter families. Like, I changed my name and I bought myself a formal breast binder. By the time I went off to college, there was maybe a year and a half from the age of 12 until the age of 18 where I didn't bind my breasts.
Hmm.
But then I hit 18 and I immediately bought a breast binder. And I was convinced, okay, this is a safe, approved binder. This is great. It did its job, right? It made my chest flat. The thing with binding, especially the interesting thing about like so-called safe binding, is that really there's like no evidence that any breast binding is safe. Like your breasts are not
Yeah.
supposed to be squished like down or like under your armpits. Your rib cage is not meant to be squashed. Your lungs are also not meant to be squashed. Over time, this damage, it creeps up on you and you don't even realize it until it's way too late,
Hmm.
until you've sustained damage to your body that is irreversible. And no one tells you that, right? Because no one expects you to bind your breasts for like 10 years. Like I bound my breasts for 10 years in various capacities. Then it became very hard to wear like regular bras after that, right? The sensation of it, when you've already kind of maybe bruised a rib or like damaged giving yourself some nerve
Hmm.
damage or something, like, so you think, okay, I can't wear a regular bra. Like this is insane. I can't do this. And so then I got the safe breast binder, and they said you can wear it for 8 hours a day and it's totally fine. But there's no evidence as to why you should wear it for 8 hours as opposed to for any other arbitrary duration of time. There are no studies showing that binding can be done safely in any capacity, just like with anything else in this like trans technomedical labyrinth. And frankly, like, no one expects you to be binding your breasts for 10 years. Like,
Right.
usually what happens is that you bind your breasts, it becomes so uncomfortable that like the next logical step to take is to have your breast removed. So I'd started breast binding, and my parents, maybe after my first year of college, had figured out that I was transitioning at school because like I changed my name in the portal, and even though they said they would send all mail home with a legal name, they didn't. So
Mm.
I ended up like, you know my parents found out and they basically put in some very strict boundaries. Like, you're not going to medicalize. And, there are a bunch of other requirements. And they said, and one of them was that I needed to study abroad either for a semester or for a year in a non-Western country where this stuff wasn't being pushed. And, anyways, I ended up in Israel because, I'd been there previously on a different trip with my school. And I realized that everyone there perceived me to be a man, and I've talked about that at length in other interviews, but basically, because this culture didn't have a schema for like a butch lesbian or a trans man outside of Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, I passed maybe 50, 60% of the time as a young guy, young boy. But in other cities, like in Jerusalem or in the West Bank or in basically every other Israeli city, because they didn't have these schemas for like what does gender nonconformity look like in a female, they just thought I
Hmm.
was a teenage boy. And so I was able to really fly under the radar and live there as a man pretty convincingly, like, you know, without any medical interventions. Like, I kept binding my breasts. I worked to, become an Israeli citizen with the hope of, like, navigating this hellish bureaucracy, becoming a citizen so that I could medicalize. That was the goal. So I worked a lot of jobs for cash. I'd like LARP as an Orthodox Jewish guy and clean houses for these families. And like I was also an Israeli Palestinian peace activist, so I found myself, in the West Bank a lot, hanging out with Palestinians. Like I speak Arabic, English, Russian, Arabic, Hebrew. So I spoke the languages. I was really able to integrate myself into basically every single sector of this society. And it was really rewarding. Like, I really enjoyed transition. Don't get me wrong, like it was great. Like when people say they regret transition, I don't think that it means that they regret all of it. Like,
Yeah.
and I think it really depends on the person. Like there might be some people who regret all of it, but there might be some people who like don't regret much of it. And there might be some people who can like say, okay, this was good for me at the time and now I've moved on. And like that's like you kind of rationalizing it psychologically. Obviously, the harms of the pathway are objective. Regardless of
Right.
whether or not someone regrets transition, the harms to the body are objective. Like whether or not you regret looking like a man, that's totally subjective. Like you might regret the aesthetic changes, but you might not regret the aesthetic changes. But then like you don't have a functioning reproductive system and you don't have your gonads, so you can't produce your own hormones. Like so
Yeah.
at some point, I think that like regret, I think that focusing on regret is also not totally correct. So, like I don't think we're able to fully understand the nature of these harms when we look at subjective patient report, because
Hmm.
that's how traditionally gender medicine has always done it. Like, with the adults in Europe, the adults would say that they were happier, but then they wouldn't be very functional. It would be hard for them to maintain employment, right? It would be hard for them to have satisfying relationships with partners. Their mental health wasn't doing better, right? Their kind of utilization of psychiatric services post-intervention was not better. And actually, like Dutch clinicians noticed this. And they said, yeah, like transition is not a panacea. This is not going to solve all of your problems. But instead of saying to themselves, wait a second, we thought that by liberating the gendered soul from these people's like sex bodies, that they would be doing better, and now they're not. Instead of trying to figure out why, instead of trying to say to themselves, like, wait, is it possible that our clinical pathway, that our attempt to solve this problem medically, maybe we were wrong? Instead of coming to that conclusion, they came to the conclusion of, oh, it's because we couldn't nail the cosmetics enough. Like, these are adult men, they can't pass as women. And they say they've been feeling this way since they were kids. So there must be a transsexual child, right? We need to find these
Mm.
kids and we need to treat them early. And so like in the 80s, late 80s, it started with giving cross-sex hormones to teenagers at about 16. But then puberty blockers came onto the market for, legitimate problems, central precocious puberty and the like. And they were used as cancer treatments. And, they had like, clinical uses. And yes, they were used like even for non-gender dysphoria reasons irresponsibly in a lot of ways, which is why,
Yeah.
it's becoming less and less popular, even for like objective health, measurable health problems for clinicians to use puberty blockers. They'll only use it now, like in the most precocious cases of puberty. They're not going to use it on a 7 or 8 year old, right? But anyways, so like I was living as a man. It was fun. It was great, whatever, but I always had this like big secret, right? Like I knew that this transition would have a shelf life. Like the social transition, medicalizing it has a shelf life because I looked very young. And the older I got, I didn't have a beard. I didn't start to, develop in these more typical like male ways because I'm female. And so I knew that like if I wanted this to last, I would need to medicalize. But because I didn't have access to the healthcare system in Israel, because I wasn't a citizen and for some other reasons, I knew I needed to become a citizen. So that became my goal. In the back of my head, the entire time, I was definitely like worried about being found out, because in the West, frankly, there are not really very big consequences for someone being so-called misgendered. Like it might hurt your ego or whatever. And like if you're a prostitute, then there can be violence there. But as far as like your average day-to-day ongoings, there aren't huge risks to being misgendered in the West. But where I was in the Middle East, like I was very attuned to hearing which pronouns people used for me because the languages I spoke were very gendered. There's no way to avoid gendering yourself or having someone gender you, especially in Hebrew. There's no way of constructing a sentence to have it be gender neutral in some way. And so that's how I know that I passed very well, is because people would use these male pronouns and because I'd go to the Western Wall. And if I ever did try to go onto the women's side, I would get escorted out of there because they thought I was like some teenage boy who was like an ignorant tourist who didn't know that it was like a sex segregated space. So I'd go onto the men's side and then everything would be great for me there, no one suspected otherwise. And so anyways, like yeah, I was binding the entire time and sometimes I'd have to sleep in the damn thing because doing some like peace activism and I couldn't have them find out that I was female. Like you don't want to screw around with this type of stuff in the Middle East. Like the stakes are really high. I really did understand by living through wars how impractical transition is. And that started before October 7th. That started in 2021. But like it really all came to a head on October 7th because the stakes were just so much higher. And that made me even further realize like how impractical transition is. As I was in the process of transition, like I had all these friends, very few of them knew that I was female. I did have some trans friends. One of them actually gave me a little bit of her testosterone gel, just a few packets, not a ton. Like I don't talk about it that much because everyone's so obsessed with like the medical and surgical transition. And understandably, it's like it's risky and it's permanent and you can see it on someone, right? Like women with lower voices and women with, scars where their breasts should be like it's obviously tragic and so there's a reason why that gets all the focus. But in my mind, like that's not actually where the harm begins. The harm doesn't begin in the gender doctor's office. And in my mind, the cross-dressing bit, not a huge deal, right? Like I mean, it's more sticky for men because it's obviously not at all socially acceptable for men to like wear dresses. But like at least for the girls, I don't see that like dressing in a more masculine style as being like cementing the trajectory or harmful. It's just a style choice, right? Like
Hmm.
it does become a problem though, like if parents push too much against that because they see it as being like an action associated with transition, and then their girls start to develop the idea that like, oh, I can't be a girl and like these things. That's where I see the problem coming in. But like in general, I see no problem with just letting kids play around with styles that their parents find to be like odd and like ugly to look at. This is a normal teenage thing. But like I see
Right.
the harm as beginning not from the moment that the young person enters the gender clinic, but from the moment that they adopt the idea about themselves that they were born in the wrong body and they start to, fixate all of their energy on becoming this other type of person. They try to resolve their like developmental distress and other deeper issues by trying to become a totally different person. That's the moment that the harm begins. And it starts out, as like psychosocial harm, right? They first psychologically they start to believe that there's something fundamentally wrong about them. And they might have believed that before, but now they have words for it. And so they believe it even more. They're like, oh yeah, here's this pathology I have that needs treatment.
Mm.
And so in their pursuit of treating their issues, they need to start altering their appearance, right? They'll bind their breasts for women, and they'll do this basically every day. And for males, they'll tuck their genitals. And I don't think they need to do this every day, frankly. But like a lot of them will do it, pretty often. But like you have this psychosocial harm that comes from adopting the idea, then it starts to become like physical harm when you start to bind your breasts or tuck your genitals. Those are interventions that do cause irreversible damage. And we don't talk about it. We act like the only irreversible damage that comes is from these medical interventions. But it's
Right.
not. It comes
And
start to damage your body with binding and tucking. That's where it starts. And it can be very much, it can be so irreversible and it is so uncomfortable that actually it is those interventions that cause this young person who is now even more distressed than they were before because they've become fixated on the idea of passing as the opposite sex. So they're now, instead of comparing themselves to their same-sex peers, they're comparing themselves to their opposite-sex peers. And they'll never be able to measure up because they're not a member of the opposite sex. And so they're going to bind, right? They're going to do all these things. They're going to try to like approximate the appearance of the opposite sex. And it's not going to like scratch that itch. It's not going to get them there. It's not going to actually turn them into a member of the opposite sex. So then they escalate, right?
mhm.
So then, because they've started to believe that there is something fundamentally wrong about them, they've started to enact these transition rituals. Now, on top of psychological discomfort of feeling wrong, and now of like being misgendered, because now their goal is to be seen as the opposite sex, because that's the coping mechanism. Then, like once they bind, they'll start to experience like issues, with their breast tissue, nerve damage, pain in the ribs. And the next logical step is removing the breasts, or for the boys,
Mhm.
removing the genitals, and, with hormonal interventions, right? And so, in my mind, transition is a trajectory. It's not a set of discrete interventions. Like, even in trans communities, they'll basically say, like, oh, you don't need to transition to be trans, and not all trans people want hormones, not all trans people want surgeries. So it's very much like a pick your own, a la carte kind of treatment model through gender medicine. It's like pick your own, mix and match, whatever works for you, but there's no actual framework given for the person to figure out like, okay, which interventions would be good for me, right? Because all this is pseudoscience. Like if any of this were scientific, there would be like a good clinical criteria for like these treatments are going to benefit you because they're going to solve this problem and they're going to fix this pathway. But that's not how gender medicine works. And so like transition is a trajectory. The trajectory is set in motion from the moment of ideation. In order for the social transition to have a stable shelf life, medicalization needs to be in the picture. That's the way this entire trajectory works. And with every single step, you accrue unique harms. The harms of like the ideation are basically like, that you're wasting all this energy and all this time on kind
Yeah.
of thinking of yourself as the opposite sex. Then you socially transition, and the harms of that are psychosocial in nature. And then you add like, binding and tucking. And so you have the psychosocial harms, you have the physical harms of those interventions, and all of those harms from ideation to social transition to also binding and tucking. The only logical step for those harms is even further harms, the ones related to hormones and to surgeries. And the longer you go about transition, the more of these steps you take, the more like harms you accrue, the worse those harms get, and the more unique of a patient profile you have. Because it's also about like whatever genetic, predispositions you have. Like if you have like a history of heart attacks, going on testosterone is like really going to raise that risk. If you're a male and you have like a history of smoking, and you're also taking estrogen, and you have some other predispositions in the family, like you can get some like pulmonary embolism. Like the types of medical risks that you experience from doing these interventions are based on like previous medical contraindications. And the same thing
Right.
actually goes for something like binding and tucking. Like for me, the damage I've experienced is really quite severe. And it's not just aesthetic either. There's like nerve pain, nerve damage. Like I need a very high compression sports bra just to walk up and down the stairs if I don't want to feel excruciating
Mhm.
pain. Like right now I'm trying to sit up straight and it's very painful because the muscles, my muscles have atrophied and my ribs hurt. Like if I lay down in different positions, it's like excruciating pain. And it's pain that has only gotten worse since I stopped binding because while I was binding, I expected it to hurt, but no one tells you that you're going to stop binding and that there's no going back from what I've done. And everyone seems to think that what I've done is some so-called reversible intervention. It's not. All this pain sneaks up on you and you don't fully realize it until you stop binding, either because you've had a mastectomy or because you stop binding and you're like, I can't do this anymore. This entire thing was a mistake. I guess my biggest takeaway in general for the listeners is that we need to start thinking of transition not as a set of discrete steps where you do social transition and then medical transition and then surgical transition. There are a lot of young men who will medically transition and won't socially transition, sometimes for years or ever. They will just medically transition. There are some people who will socially transition and then, do the binding and then they might bind for a long time and go on hormones and and then they won't get a mastectomy. Maybe they just like, and they'll have their breasts, but then they'll have, all these issues from hormones. Like there are so many different ways that transition can look and therefore the detransition can look. And so I think that we need to really start thinking of transition not as you go to the doctor and you get a prescription, because also that leaves out all the people who are doing DIY hormones. That's another thing we need to talk more about. Like, it's very easy to access these hormones without a prescription. I was able to. I wasn't able to access tons of them without a prescription, but like if I were in the United States, I would have been able to access with or without a prescription really high doses of testosterone. It's just because of, where my parents sent me to try to protect me, that I didn't, end up doing more damage to myself in the 12 years that I was like trans identifying.
So I've noticed some controversy online about what defines a detransitioner. I've seen you, but also other creators I'm a big fan of, being criticized for calling themselves detransitioners, as according to some other people, they haven't met certain thresholds, like taking cross-sex hormones or undergoing surgery. And even me, I've actually received, similar criticisms since I wasn't on hormones very long and I didn't have any surgery. Like some people are like, oh, you're just a grifter if you say you're a detransitioner, but you didn't get surgery. What does the term detransitioner mean to you? Like, what definition would you give to that? And do you think that there should be any type of, gatekeeping, for lack of a better term, around the word detransitioner?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'd say that when we try to figure out like who applies to a certain label or like which words to use, we have to figure out like why does it matter, right? Like why does it matter? And in this case, it matters for a couple main reasons. The first is obviously there's like a political meaning, right? Like in which case it makes sense to have anyone who has transitioned to any degree and then who has stopped that process to tell their story. Because the idea, given by trans activists is obviously that everyone who says they're trans is trans and that basically no one regrets it and no one detransitions. This like tiny percentage of people. And when they say that most trans people don't regret it, they're referring to anyone who just makes an identity claim. Like to be trans, all you have to do is to make an identity claim. Now, as far
Mhm.
as to transition, because when we're saying detransitioner, it's already a very difficult term to define because it's like there's never really an endpoint for transition. The endpoint is death. Like you do it and then you keep doing it and then you die. Like no one expects you to ever reverse course. The medical pathway does not take into account the fact that there are people who will transition to various extents and then disembark from that process. And so from like a clinical standpoint, I think that what makes the most sense is to say that if you transitioned in any capacity, and that includes social, it includes physical but non-medical, like buying and tucking. It can also be with, cross-sex hormone regimens, puberty blockers, testosterone blockers, like anti-androgens, and it can include these different surgeries, like these elective body modifications that are all framed as like life-saving healthcare. So I think that the term detransitioner should include embarked upon the transition pathway to whatever extent that they did and who is trying to disembark from it, who is trying to discontinue this pathway to the extent to which they can, right? Because it gets really sticky. Like some people have been on cross-sex hormones for so long that they'll have to take exogenous hormones for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
And then the issue becomes like, especially in the case of males like who have had genital surgery, it's a big issue of like which hormones do I take? Because like with, post SRS, the way that those nerves are severed, it can be very painful to have like, blood flow and erectile function, restored to those tissues post op. So a lot of men will opt for like estrogen or go for a long time without any hormones. And so at that point, it's just like their transition will basically go back to like they'll try to socially detransition, maybe cutting their hair, changing their clothes, using their birth name or masculine name, and the male pronouns. And similar thing can happen for females. So like it gets very sticky about like, what does it mean to detransition? Because in trans communities, detransition means so many different things too. There will be people who will, I guess, stop hormones, but will continue to trans identify and to live as the opposite sex. They won't change their appearance or anything. They're not going to like go back and say, "Oh, guys, like I'm a girl." They're going to stay transitioned socially, but not medically. So in that case, if we're having a definition of a detransitioner, I think it's actually a really tricky definition that has a very limited scope in what it can accomplish. Because like if the point of the question of who is a detransitioner is to determine for whom does this pathway not work based on purely self-report, not based on like functional measures, which is really what we should be measuring, because these interventions have like physical, measurable impacts. So the
Hmm.
fact that we're using regret as a metric of did this go well or did this not is asinine in my opinion, irresponsible and
Totally.
asinine. This is not how we are supposed to like look at clinical outcomes. It's not based on like does this person like regret having healthy body parts removed? I mean, that's like it's better if they don't regret it, obviously, but just because they don't regret it, it doesn't mean that they weren't harmed. Like so
Absolutely.
when we're asking the question of who is a detransitioner, the question I would ask back, like, because I've provided my definition. My definition is anyone who was in transition and who stops it, right, to
Yeah.
whatever extent, could be classified under this big umbrella. If there's a trans umbrella, there should be a detrans umbrella. That's the only thing that makes sense because at that point, if you're saying no, it has to be hormones and surgery, then it's like, okay, how many injections of hormones? Can it be packets of T-gel? Or does it have to be cross-sex hormones? How many months do you have to have been on these cross-sex hormones before disembarking? Like,
Right.
then we're just splitting weeds. And ultimately, I think what a lot of these debates come down to, a lot of this is just oppression Olympics all over again. It's trans oppression Olympics taken into the detrans space of like, who got hurt more? And like I understand why this is such a compelling framework for people to rationalize their pain. Like I really do get it. I just don't think it's conducive to healing in any way to like compare yourself to other people and say, "Oh, this person got out of it and she still has her breasts," or like her voice bounced back. It is so not conducive to healing. It is so clinically unhelpful to see it in this way because then when we're thinking about like detransition as a phenomenon, about identifying as the opposite sex and then stopping identifying as the opposite sex, then theoretically the medical component is totally unnecessary, right? If we're doing it totally based on identity. But if we're doing it based on action, then any action taken towards the transition pathway, that could be like any of these actions I've previously mentioned, social, legal, medical, surgical, hormonal, physical, blah 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 blah. All
Yeah.
these interventions that you can do to obscure the appearance of your sex characteristics so as to pass as either not your sex or the opposite sex. That's the transition pathway. If you do any of those things and then you stop doing them, I think that you would fall under the transition umbrella. That is the only thing that makes sense based on how we define transition, with a caveat of obviously not everyone's so-called transition looks the same way. Like I've said before, and like it's widely known, it's a grab bag of interventions. And so, and,
Yeah.
and also, like I've said before, transition is a trajectory. The harm doesn't start when the doctor gets involved. The doctor escalates the harm in unimaginably worse ways, but the harm starts before then. Like, I don't know how many girls would get their breasts removed if binding wasn't something that was suggested to them by both trans activists and by the doctors who just take the trans activists at their word and publish binding and tucking guidelines about how to do these things so-called safely. So the doctors can recommend these interventions, but because they don't have to prescribe them, they're exempt from any kind of studying them, any kind of informed consent, right? They just take the trans activist word for it, and then it's expected that it's going to be safe. So like it's really hard to separate the doctor's office from the trans activists like giving information online because there is no like legitimate medical body that is an activist in nature that handles these issues. We need to stop seeing the harms of transition as the only harms of transition that exist are the ones that you can see. That is false. That is,
Right.
again, thinking about the body in gender medicine terms as like a bunch of body parts that you can like Mr. Potato Head, you can take off one body part, exchange it. It's a flawed way of thinking about the body. It's a flawed way of thinking about the nature of transition related harms. And so someone who wants to heal from that, in my mind, whether or not they want to stop identifying as trans, I think that this, like any detrans healthcare that starts, like any detrans health clinics, like the ones they're opening in the UK, it needs to include also people who are currently trans identifying but who are harmed by transition. Because, frankly, this is not work that gender medicine is going to do, and it shouldn't be based on identity. It's wrong to make medical pathways with irreversible consequences be only available on the basis of subjective self-identification. That's wrong. Like, it needs to be based on the consequences. Now that people who are transitioning do so many of these very consequential interventions at the same time, it's really hard to figure out like why it is that the post mastectomy you'll have issues with like nipple rejection or with skin elasticity. Part of it is obviously due to the fact that the breasts are removed, but part of it is very likely due to the fact that binding reduces the quality of your skin elasticity and your breast
Mm.
tissue, which is why gender
Yep.
doctors before mastectomy will say take off the binder. So there are so many questions that need to be explored. And if we want to help anyone recover from any of the damage, be it psychological, be it psychosocial, or be it like physical, medical, embodied, post-surgical harms, we will only ever be able to help people recover from transition if we study the way that every single one of these interventions occurs, including those harms experienced by people who have done some of these interventions and not others. And we need people who have done all of these interventions and to study what's happened to them, because that's the closest we'll be able to get for like a long-term patient outcome. And that's the only way that anyone, regardless of whether they identify as trans or whether they detransition and re-identify with their birth sex, everyone who embarks upon this pathway and wishes to either like become a functional member of society and or to heal from the harms of this pathway, like that requires us to think about this in a way that actually makes sense instead of in an identity politics based way. That's my take.
Yeah, you made some really excellent points, and I really enjoyed when you said about the regret and how so often it's framed as, only this group of people regret their transition, but the harm is present whether the regret is present or not. And sometimes it can take people years or decades to realize this, but the psychological and the physical interventions are pretty much guaranteed to result in harm at some point down the road. Well, Maya, I've really enjoyed talking with you. Thank you for your bravery and speaking out and for your time to chat with me today and share your story. Before we go, where can people find you?
Yeah. Also, it was a real pleasure to speak with you, Kat. This has been a while in the making, so I really appreciate it. So you can find me. I'm on Substack at Maya Poet. I'm also on X at the Peace Poet 99. I'm also on YouTube at Maya Poet, I think. I don't know. Mostly these days I'm on Substack. I write really like in-depth essays, where I analyze some other aspect of this phenomenon. I'm really trying to like get us out of this idiotic culture war mindset because like the culture war was great in that it got us this far. It got us to the point where, we have a president who's doing, these executive orders, but the truth is that the culture war has to oversimplify what is an incredibly complex psychosocial, techno-medical, institutional capture labyrinth. The complexities of what we have allowed to happen to our society are astronomical. And it will take us a very long time to get out of it. So we should not automatically assume that legislation is going to solve this. We should also shouldn't assume that banning medical transition for kids is going to stop those kids from getting harmed. They're just going to wait until they're 18. Let's be honest. Like, let's be very, very honest. These 18 to 25-year-olds were brainwashed as kids. Like, anyone who thinks that we've solved the issue of kids getting harmed, by banning medical transition, this is just a really, really big problem. I cannot understate. Like, we need to not see these victories as a sign that we've solved the problem and to back off. It means that actually the culture war has its limits. There's a bigger cultural problem, an institutional problem, a mental health problem. And we need to start thinking about it in radically different ways. And on my Substack, the goal is really to get beyond the culture war, to delve into parenting and the psychology of transition. I like to explore these topics in depth because I think that the public just deserves someone who will be no nonsense and who isn't going to use like stupid political rhetoric that totally stunts our understanding. Like, yeah, we know it's bad. Men and women's sports, ooh, bad. Like, we've known that for a few years. Those who know, know. People know that it's bad to transition kids. Again, those who know, know. You can never really convince a true believer. There's so much, out about this now that, we're starting to convince our institutions, which is great, but we need to not stay stagnant. Like, we need to think about these issues in so much more depth because we've gotten ourselves into this situation over the course of decades. I mean, the first so-called sex change that was documented, was performed in 1931 in Germany, and this industry has morphed and like involved so many more institutions over the course of nearly a whole century, and it's only become more experimental as time has gone on, not less. So we're dealing with like rogue medicine that is underpinned by an ideology that has captured our institutions, and simply passing legislation will not get us out of this mess. It is great progress. It will not get us out of this mess. We need to start having more sober conversations that are dealing in the real world. And ultimately, we need to all collectively decide on a strategy that involves like actual critical thinking, diagnosing where every single sector of our society went wrong, because we can keep blaming our political rivals, right? I see this all the time. Like liberals who are gender critical will blame the conservatives for having strict gender roles and saying your strict gender roles are the reason why these kids think they're in the wrong body. And the conservatives will say, no, it's because you let your boys play dress up, because you're so permissive that we've gotten us here. But actually, both liberals and conservatives screwed this issue up, but for reasons that neither side is stating. In order to have a crisis of this magnitude, every single one of us screwed up. Every single adult who watched this play out over the course of their lifetimes, most notably in the case of Jazz Jennings,
Hmm.
castrated on TV, national TV. We saw him getting indoctrinated in 2007. We watched this entire thing play out. Basically, no one spoke up until after he was castrated, until after, the tide had begun to shift. No one had the guts. There were millions of people watching. Very few people spoke out against it. Very few. And those who were dismissed. And they were dismissed because they were on the religious right. And the reason that the religious right was against this stuff with jazz is it was for religious reasons, and because they didn't think it was okay for a boy to be effeminate. So our discourse on this has been so wrong this entire time. And in order to get to a crisis of this incredible magnitude, where it is not just a niche Dutch medical experiment, it is like the zeitgeist of the youth in the entire Anglophone West, and there's a techno-medical industry propping it up, and every single one of our institutions is colluding with these false, dangerous, harmful ideas. The fact that we've gotten ourselves into this situation means that basically, like every single sector of our society, comprised of a bunch of different adults, gay adults, straight adults, religious adults, secular adults, psychologists, therapists, doctors, right? Teachers, like every single sector of our society and every single identity group of adults failed to protect this next generation. They failed miserably. And as a result, our institutions are in tatters, and it's going to take a very, very long time for us to diagnose the problems that made our institutions so vulnerable to accepting these bad ideas on the one hand and to proliferating them on the other end. We're going to need to do that. We're going to need to do less of the making fun of, people's appearance or relying on the same old taglines of kids can't consent. Do what you want when you're 18. Because then at that point, it's like, well, then do doctors have any responsibility? I cannot stress this enough. It frustrates me. The level of the discourse really frustrates me sometimes. We've already basically shifted a lot of people's minds on this.
Yeah.
We need to shift our strategy now to actually figuring out, diagnosing what went wrong in our institutions, what went wrong in our society. Where did everyone abdicate their responsibility? How the hell did this happen? If we can't understand how the hell this happened and what we can do to fortify our institutions so that a crisis of this magnitude never, ever happens again, we will have failed all of the kids who are already harmed by this, and we will fail another future generation. We need to think critically, and we need to come up with a plan for how to deal with all these kids who will now be denied the panacea that they were promised and who were told that they'll off themselves if they don't get it. We know suicide is also very socially contagious. We have to stop pretending that there's an easy fix. If you're committed to helping these kids, whatever role you take in this movement, you also like need to commit to like doing the kind of boring, strategic, unpopular, not flame worthy, not flame war type of thinking, because like that's what our society deserves. Like we need to repair the damage that was done, and it starts with every single person, in my mind, trying to answer the question of where was I when Jazz Jennings got castrated? Where were my friends? What does that say about our society, right? Because there's the bystander effect. There are so many reasons that people like abdicate their responsibility. There's also brainwashing. There are all these other factors. And I'm not saying this because I want people to blame themselves. I'm saying this because, like, yeah, like we need to ask uncomfortable questions in order to get ourselves out of this mess we've gotten ourselves into. So the point of my Substack is really to try to answer some of those questions and to kind of hope that, that we can as a society, begin to understand the magnitude of what we've done and the type of effort that it's going to take for us to actually get ourselves out of this.
Yeah, I think it's really important work that you're doing in terms of deepening the conversation. There is just so much more to like the picture. So everyone go subscribe to Maya's Substack, follow her on X. And yeah, thank you for the great conversation, Maya. I'm sure we'll be in touch. And yeah, take care.